of what day it is for the record.
Okay, should start there. It's now started. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Melissa. This is January 25, 2021. This is the meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. Our agenda includes presentations from other state guests who have worked on Global Warming Solutions Acts and developing climate action plans, as well as a facilitated discussion of a process roadmap with CBI. David Plum is here and he'll introduce the team when we get to that on the agenda item. So we'll begin with an introduction of Jane Lazorchak by Secretary Moore. She's our new project manager.
Great. Thank you very much, Secretary Young. It is my absolute pleasure to share with the Council that we have hired Jane Lazorchak as the Global Warming Solutions Act project manager. Jane may be a familiar face to some of you, as she's worked at the Department of Fish and Wildlife since 2006. Where her work is really focused on the permanent conservation of land. She spent extensive time working with landowners and partner organizations to conserve more than 10,000 acres during this time. And most recently has been the public lands section chief within the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Jane is going to formally make the transition into this role full-time starting, I believe, February 8th. But between now and then, we'll continue to both do her work with Fish and Wildlife and participate more and more in the work of the Council. I don't know, Jane, if you'd like to say a few words to folks.
Morning, everybody. I'm really honored to be here and looking forward to a really great and exciting new opportunity to sort of tap in, get to know all of you, and work on behalf of the Council to enact a plan coming this fall. So, as Julie suggested, my experience is varied in background, so I look forward to gaining experiences with all of you in all the different sectors. Most of my work has focused on large project management and with varied partners and interests representing Vermonters. I see myself as a public servant both there and now on behalf of all of you to get this ambitious plan done in the coming months. More specifically, with respect to experience for this work, I did represent the agency over the last few years on the natural and working lands sector for the Climate Alliance, and now specifically on a work group looking at enrollment of state lands with respect to carbon projects. So I look forward to learning even more. As Julie said, I should say, I have 2 more weeks in my other job, so I'm going to try to balance wearing both hats for a little bit, but looking forward to being here, and please don't hesitate to reach out in the coming weeks as I get to know all of you. So thanks so much.
Welcome, Jane. We really look forward to working with you, and it's great to have you on board. I think it's a critical hire for us to, move forward with planning. So at this point, I will ask David Plum of CBI to introduce himself and turn the meeting over to him to guide us through the agenda and where we are going to be focusing today. David?
Great, Secretary Young, thanks so much. My name is David Plum. It's nice to meet many of you. It's hard on these virtual calls to actually meet you, but I'll be helping to guide today's conversation, and in particular, I'll be helping out in the afternoon, or in our second conversation of the day, which is around our process roadmap. Just as a good practice, I'm going to show just quickly our agenda here. If my team cooperates with me, just give me 1 second. Teams may or may not cooperate with me. That's a good point. Here we go. Let's try this. This is what we're going to be doing today. Please let me know if you can't see that. We will be having this first conversation with a handful of folks who have walked down this road already, whether it's from the state of Maine or state of New York or the U.S. Climate Alliance. We'll have some Q&A on the back of that, so you can ask them questions about what made their process work. We will then take a break at 10 o'clock. And we'll come back at 10:15, and I'll lead us in a conversation about a draft process roadmap. I'll be presenting some ideas and some slides about what will likely work or what may work the basis of this is from a set of conversations I had with many of you, the Climate Council members, either myself or my colleagues over the last week or so. We've really spoken to almost all of you, and so we've appreciated those conversations. And the draft process roadmap we'll be talking about will reflect the content of those conversations. We'll finish up with next steps. We will have public comment period at the end of this. So members of the public, thank you so much for joining us. And there will be a space at the end to interact and ask questions. So thanks for hanging in there throughout the whole meeting. We'll finish up by 12:45. Okay, so that's what we're doing today. The first piece is taking advantage of folks who are also, like I mentioned, who have walked this road before or are walking it right now. And I'll let Secretary Moore introduce the panelists we have. And we've asked them to speak for no more than 15 minutes, so hopefully 12 to 15 minutes each. And then we'll use the rest of our time in this block to do some Q&A to really glean from their experience. I will just mention as a full disclosure, I'm just finishing up working with Hannah Pingree, who's joining us here from the state of Maine, in guiding the work of the Maine Climate Council. And I'm here in Portland, Maine, joining you from Portland today. All right, so Secretary Moore, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guests today?
Happy to. Thank you, David. I'm going to introduce all four speakers and then we'll just bring up the presentations one after the other. Our first panelist this morning is Maureen Leddy. Maureen's the Director of the Office of Climate Change at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, a position she's held since September of 2019. The Office of Climate Change is charged with connecting environmental and energy policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase resiliency, empower New York's communities, and provide low carbon options for all New Yorkers. Prior to joining DEC, Maureen was a project manager in the large-scale renewables program at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, also known as NYSERDA. And Maureen has also worked in carbon finance, quantifying greenhouse gas reduction potential for energy efficiency and renewable energy projects, and has many years of experience in environmental consulting that also includes contaminated sites remediation, environmental permitting, and regulatory compliance projects. Our second speaker will be David Ismay, who is the Undersecretary for Climate Change in Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, where he leads the state's efforts to implement its Global Warming Solution Act. Prior to joining the Baker administration in October of 2019, David was a senior attorney for the Conservation Law Foundation in Boston, where he focused on Massachusetts energy and climate policy and New England's wholesale electricity and gas markets. He was also an adjunct lecturer in energy law and policy at Northeastern University School of Law, and prior to that was a senior associate with Farella, Braun, and Martel in San Francisco, where he practiced infrastructure, renewable energy, and land use law. And before law school, he served as a surface warfare and special warfare officer with the U.S. Navy. Our third speaker is Hannah Pingree, who is the Director of the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation and the Future for the state of Maine, a position she's held since January of 2019. The Office of Policy Innovation and the Future leads strategic planning efforts for the state of Maine on critical issues like healthcare, workforce development, and climate change that require cross-department coordination, long-term management, coordination with federal or private funders, and engagement with the legislature, stakeholder organizations, and the public. Hannah's responsibilities include coordinating the work of Maine's Climate Council. Previously, Hannah served 4 terms in the state legislature, including serving as Speaker of the House in her final term before leaving office in 2010. Hannah also has a background in managing several small family businesses, including a farm, restaurant, and inn, and currently chairs her local school board. And our fourth speaker is Carrie Enright Cato, who's a senior policy advisor with the U.S. Climate Alliance, where her specific roles include supporting alliance states, Vermont among them, in the development and implementation of policies that reduce transportation sector emissions. Prior to joining the Climate Alliance, Carrie served as the Director of the Office of Climate Change, Technology, and Research at the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, where she was responsible for setting statewide priorities and technical direction to ensure meeting the state's statutory greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. Her work at DEEP included coordinating with the Governor's Council on Climate Change, guiding the development of statewide policy planning documents, and representing Connecticut's climate change and energy policy interests in regional efforts like RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative. I am thrilled to have all four of these speakers here today. Look forward to learning from them along with you, and am pleased to turn it over to Maureen.
Great, thank you so much. Will you be operating the slide deck, or is that my responsibility?
I'm happy to do it, or have you do it, whatever is easiest.
If you would do it, that'd be great.
Okay. Give me just
so as Secretary Moore mentioned, I did join the DEC in late 2019, and it was a really golden opportunity that the vacancy came up, and it was right at the time when the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act had been passed by the New York State Legislature. DEC and NYSERDA were gearing up on how they were going to implement this incredible law, and I was drawn to the position for that purpose, because now there was this groundbreaking piece of legislation that was going to drive climate change across New York State in a new way, more aggressive way. And it was just such an incredible opportunity to be part of that effort. So I wanted to share with this group, we definitely went through the pains of figuring out how do we accomplish all of the goals of the Act and how we manage the Climate Action Council. We can move to the next slide. So the CLCPA put into statute a lot of the clean energy and carbon reduction goals that the state had, and now they're statutory requirements. And it even went further. So the law requires the state of New York achieve an 85% reduction in emissions over a 1990 baseline by 2050, and also to be net carbon neutral by that date, with an interim target of 40% reduction by 2030. It puts our electricity sector on a 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040, with 70% renewable by 2030, and then all of our goals for adoption or deployment of renewables and storage and energy efficiency are now codified in the law. So it changed the environmental conservation law, which is the governing statute for DEC. It also amended the public service law, which is the governing statute for the Public Service Commission and all the energy policies. And it also included very robust commitments to climate justice and just transition. So throughout the law, there are requirements to ensure that the actions the state takes protect disadvantaged communities, direct benefits to those communities, ensure that the workforce is protected throughout. Next slide, please. So I think I might skip one. Back one, thank you. So the Act lays out some roles and responsibilities. It creates the Climate Action Council, and the Climate Action Council is primarily responsible for developing a scoping plan of recommendations to achieve the emissions reductions requirements. It creates a climate justice working group, which is housed within DEC, to establish the criteria for what it means to be a disadvantaged community. There's some new criteria there that's beyond what we would have used to define environmental justice communities in the past, because there's more emphasis put on vulnerability to climate change and other factors. It created a Just Transition Working Group, which is under the purview of the Climate Action Council, to study job creation and workforce disruption related to the transition that the state will go through to achieve the emissions reductions. It assigned the PSC the responsibility for developing a program to meet the energy system requirements of 70% renewable by 2030 and 100% carbon free by 2040. It gave DEC the authority to promulgate regulations to achieve the emissions reductions that come out of the scoping plan. DEC is also responsible for our new greenhouse gas accounting. The law required that we use the 20-year global warming potential to put extra emphasis on the contribution from methane to our emissions. We also now are responsible for issuing statewide annual inventories, which had in the past been under the purview of NYSERDA in partnership with DEC. And then it also puts a provision in there that all state agencies are basically on the hook to ensure that the emissions reductions are considered in agency decision making, and also that the provisions for protection of disadvantaged communities are considered in all agency decision making. And it does provide the authority for other agencies to promulgate regulations. Next slide, please. So we're on a pretty aggressive timeline. Not as aggressive as your timeline, but then again, you guys get up really early in the morning. Our meetings don't start usually till 2. The law went into effect in the beginning of 2020. The draft scoping plan is due on January 1st of 2022. It goes out then for a series of public comment hearings, and the final is to be delivered to the governor and the legislature on January 1st, 2023. And then DEC has a year from that to promulgate the regulations, which would be January 1st, 2024. So it's really aggressive. Right now we are in the stage of the council convened a set of advisory panels required by the statute to provide recommendations for consideration by the council for inclusion in the scoping plan. And the Just Transition Working Groups also provide in that process now, pulling together their recommendations and going through their job study. So while the council is in that process, that scoping planning process, all the agencies are doing their tasks too. The Climate Justice Working Group is convened. We put out our new 1990 baseline at the end of last year. We established a value of carbon that was also required by the statute. The renewable energy programs have been set forth by the PSC, and we are in the process now of pulling together the annual inventory reports so we get a sense of where we are today under our new emissions accounting towards our goals. You know, have we lost ground? Where are we compared to how we used to count things? The law also requires that DEC put together a community air monitoring program to do very granular community level air monitoring in a set of disadvantaged communities. I believe the law says 3, maybe 4, but the DEC intends to do more. And then to gather that data, that ground level, neighborhood level air quality data, and use that as the basis of making a plan of action to address the air quality issues. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk a bit about the Climate Action Council itself. Next slide. So the New York State Climate Action Council is 22 members. It is made up of 12 agency heads. It's chaired by the president and CEO of NYSERDA and the commissioner of the DEC. And then there are 10 external appointees. There were 2 from the governor's office, 4 from the minority, and 4 from the majority. So the appointments were all made early last year. The council convened and had its first meeting in early March, the 4th of March, right before the world ended and everything went sideways. So we only ever had one in-person meeting, and we've been conducting all of those subsequent Climate Action Council meetings remotely. And I think it's been working pretty well. It's not meeting in person, it is great, but meeting remotely has its benefits too, and we're able to make progress. So you'll see that there's all agencies like the power authorities, the state power authorities, Empire State Development, the Department of Health, Homes and Community Renewal, Public Service Commission Chair, Department of Labor, Department of Agriculture and Markets. So getting a broad swath of agency participation in the formation of the scoping plan. And the external appointees come from a variety of backgrounds as well, looking at from the power side, from academia, environmental advocates, utilities, and clean energy advocacy and lobby groups. So like I said, they've met, thanks, that's good. They've met about 7 times now, and their primary responsibility is to adopt a scoping plan with recommendations to achieve the greenhouse gas emission limits, and also to get us to carbon neutrality. So there's got to be some negative emissions technologies, carbon sequestration. The plan needs to evaluate the costs and benefits, both economic and non-economic, including the accounting for the co-pollutants, and to identify measures to maximize reductions of GHGs and co-pollutants in disadvantaged communities. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also a requirement to direct the benefits of energy efficiency and renewable energy investments by the state towards disadvantaged communities. So the council itself receives recommendations from a set of advisory panels that were named in the statute and from the Just Transition Working Group. Then they consider those recommendations in the development of the plan with consultation from the Climate Justice Working Group. So the council and the advisory panels seek advice from the Climate Justice Working Group to ensure that the recommendations are sensitive and responsive to the needs of the climate justice communities. There is a requirement in the statute to hold 6 public hearings on the draft plan after it's issued, and to update the plan every 5 years. Next slide, please. So there are 7 advisory panels that have been convened. The statute named 6, and the council themselves decided to add a 7th because waste management was not named, and it is an important source of emissions that needs to be addressed and deserved its own advisory panel. So the advisory panels are sectoral: transportation, agriculture and forestry, land use and local government, power generation, housing and energy efficiency, and energy intensive and trade exposed industries, alongside with the waste management group. There's a strong emphasis too in the legislation around leakage, in that the policies and the recommendations that come forth in the scoping plan do not result in the emissions just being shipped out of state and occurring in a neighboring state or another country. That it's important that the reductions be real, that they don't result in businesses leaving the state, which is what we call emissions leakage. So each advisory panel is chaired by the Climate Action Council Commissioner. So the Commissioner of Agriculture and Markets is the chair of the Agriculture and Forestry Advisory Panel. The statute made that requirement. And the advisory panel itself determined its scope of work and its emissions reductions within their sector. So one of the earlier meetings of the Climate Action Council, New York had undertaken a carbon reduction pathways analysis, and that the information from that, thankfully we had that in process for, based upon energy plan requirements, that the state started to look and see, well, okay, we've got these energy plan requirements of 50% renewable. How do we get there? And started a analysis, like a pathways analysis. Of course, our goals and our requirements are different now, but it was a useful starting point. So that was presented to the council fairly early to give them a sense of the level of ambition in each sector in order to get us where we need to go. So it was a way to sort of set the goalposts and say, okay, well, transportation, you need to achieve, 30% or 60%. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head anymore. And again, that pathways has been redone to come up to our current level of ambition and our new emissions accounting requirements. So that was presented very early on to help the advisory panels figure out how aggressive they need to be. And the short story is super aggressive. Every sector has to be super aggressive in the emissions reductions. Then the Just Transition Working Group, as I mentioned, they are chaired by the Commissioner of Labor and the CEO of NYSERDA. That's a multi-agency and external partners group. So the advisory panels are chaired by the commissioner, but they are primarily external experts. And actually, I have a slide on that later. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. So the Just Transition Working Group and the Climate Justice Working Group. Okay, next slide. I don't want to ramble on too long here. And these are the climate justice requirements. They're very, very important. There's a lot that we need to do. I'll keep this slide for reference, but I'll move on to the next one. So the advisory panel structure. The Act was not very specific in how the advisory panel should be structured. And we had actually spoken earlier with the state of Maine because they had a similar advisory panel process in their scoping plan. And from their experience, I think their panels were quite large. They were very, very inclusive. And it's a management issue, right? There's a lot of people. It becomes difficult to manage a huge group. But it's important to have a huge group because you need that level of buy-in, because what you're doing is incredibly ambitious. So when we recommended to the panel how to form the advisory panels, we thought of kind of splitting the difference, where the core panel itself would be a limited number of people. We tried to go for 10 to 12, but the panels themselves would be required to do a lot of stakeholder engagement, to pull in external experts that were not part of the advisory panel themselves formally, but that their opinion and their expertise should be included in the process, and to also engage with the public to ensure that the advisory panel process is receiving input from the public as well. And then the advisory panels are supported by state agency staff that are working behind the scenes to help them develop their recommendations. Next slide, please. So our timeline to get to our draft. So as I said now, the advisory panels have all been stood up. They are working away, they're holding meetings, and they are developing their recommendations, and they're doing their outreach. So we are targeting the advisory panels having their final set of recommendations delivered to the council at the end of March. I mean, at the April meeting. So they need to be wrapped up by the end of March and presented to the council formally at the April meeting. And at that point, that pathways analysis that I mentioned will take those recommendations and they will feed that into that integration analysis. So we are asking the panels at this point to come up with a suite of recommendations, and the level of granularity on the cost and the emissions reductions is not super granular, but the integration analysis will do that. We'll crunch those numbers and come up with the actual emissions reductions. What we're looking for are sort of buckets of, high, medium, low cost and emissions reductions with numbers on those buckets. But that's about as detailed as we expect the panels to do, because they just don't have the time or the resources. It's, the compressed schedule doesn't allow for that. But the integration analysis will produce that information. The integration analysis also has a health impacts aspect. So not only is it looking at cost and emissions reductions, it's also looking at health impacts. So the integration analysis will run, it will iterate with the council. The panels might be called back in for refinements. And we expect by June, July, we are reviewing a draft of the integrated strategy. So we're looking at how, when we run it through the engine and the information comes out, did we miss the mark? Where do we need to adjust? And then we start to prepare the draft scoping plan for release at the end of December. So council meetings through April have been scheduled. The rest of 2021, we haven't yet calendared meetings. So, don't take those orange squares to be what really is happening. We know that we definitely need more than one meeting between April and October. But so that's our timeline to the draft. And then, of course, we go through the public hearing process and get to final. So then once we get to final, the implementation of the scoping plan is through the DEC regulations. And the DEC is required by 2024 to promulgate these regulations. So we know that's aggressive. And we know that during the public hearings, like once the public comment period ends and we're sort of halfway between draft and final, we've got to start the process of the regulation development in advance of having the final plan. Some of those, if they don't end up being in the final plan, we might need to adjust or tweak, but we can't wait until the final plan because we won't have enough time. It takes more than a year to get a regulation out. And also the state isn't just doing nothing during this planning time. We're still advancing policies. We're still working with the Climate Alliance on where we can keep achieving emissions reductions that are aligned with where the state wants to go. So that's all I have for slides. And I'm really interested to hear the other states and hear what they went through, and very much looking forward to being a part of your process.
Thank you very much, Marie. David, my understanding is you don't have slides, so if you want to start talking, I think your face will pop up onto our screen.
Great. Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for having me, Secretary Moore. And it's hard to follow New York, but it's a great process. And maybe, you know, and I spoke to Secretary Moore before this and said of the states invited here, Massachusetts is the one that does not have a similar commission process in place. So I don't have a similar level of detail to share on, you know, maybe process that would be valuable for this commission to emulate or to learn from. So I guess I'm speaking a little bit more generally, and happy to answer questions and be part of the discussion. Massachusetts passed the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2008, a few years after California's AB 32. It set a target in law, actually a legal limit in law, to achieve an 80% reduction below 1990 levels by 2050. We've been making great progress there. We have a process that requires my boss and me, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, to issue a clean energy and climate plan, updated every 5 years, and to set interim targets. So the Global Warming Solutions Act for us required the 80 by 50 final target or final limit, and set a range for determination between 15 and 25% for 2020, and then authorized and empowered the Secretary to set interim limits for 2030 and 2040. Back in 2010, we set the 2020 limit at 25%, and we are at 23% below 1990 levels as of 2017, which is our last full data year. Almost ready to issue our full data for 2018. I'll come back to that. I wrote some notes and I said process and patience. This is really, really difficult work. It's very technical. And I guess one thing I've been feeling a lot in the last month, I don't know if people have been seeing, there's been quite a battle going on in Massachusetts between the legislature and the governor right after we issued some landmark, really detailed reports and a deep decarbonization pathways roadmap report, much like the one that Maureen in New York, actually some of the same analysts involved with that. And conversation around that has been very interesting, where the ambition for change is outstripping maybe some of our administrative abilities to achieve everything on the exact timeline that folks are demanding and desiring. So there's great ambition there, and I guess one of my rules of thought, you know, Maureen said it takes about a year. It takes more than a year to get regulations done, and I think that's just sort of a fact. They can be done sooner, that's for sure. But to allow the kind of engagement that's being demanded of government now, and I could say rightly so that it's being demanded of government, but there are competing goals at issue here, and there's at some point the commission I think will need to grapple with transforming its ambition into something that is achievable. And you know, one of the lessons we learned from our analysis, and I think this is really important, is to with some humility pay attention to where your emissions are coming from and the methods for reducing those emissions. So you know, a lot of people, myself included, watch the energy UK, and that's all wonderful, but each of those places is different. They have different climates, they have different energy systems, they have different governmental systems, and so it's pretty easy to pick something up off Vox and say, I found the answer, it's X, right? And sometimes X just doesn't apply, say, to a Vermont or a Massachusetts. Sometimes it does, that's great. But so having some sort of both ambition and humility at the same time, and then at some point figuring out a way to really set up some processes and trust them and invest in the process, because I don't think any of us are going to find out the answer for every day, every hour, every year from now to 2050. So it's going to take 30 years to achieve this transition. Start to like invest in government again. Government's taken a bit of a hit across the country, and thanks to some specific individuals and certain things that have been going on in other parts of the country. But I don't see a way to do this without investing in the process, investing in government, investing and aiming for a target that we all agree upon enough to compromise at least here and there, right? And some of the things we're finding out of our roadmap study is that even if we put solar panels in we would still need more energy, and we would need more transmission lines, right? And we need offshore wind, and yes, there's fishing out in the ocean too, but you know, we can't have no offshore wind, no transmission, no solar, and have clean energy, right? So there's something has to give. There has to be some mechanism that we trust to find a place to site a transmission line and some way to work with other states. And I think Vermont probably understands going into this, but I hate to break it to you, you're a small state. So is Massachusetts, right? Massachusetts is, I deal in numbers all the time. Massachusetts is, or New York is 2.8 times bigger than Massachusetts, right? So sometimes we hear people saying, but New York is ordering more offshore wind than us. They're going to be number one. They're going to be first. You know, I would certainly expect that they'll need more offshore wind, probably about 2.8 times the amount of offshore wind. And that's because they have 2.8 times the people and the load, you know, and the emissions probably. And California is even bigger, right? So there are certain things that sort of skew with economies and skew with tax bases and skew with the ability to affect markets. And you know, one thing that we found through our analysis is that 60% of our emissions come from, as I have been starting to say, you and me, except you guys are in Vermont. 60% of our emissions come from residential heating and passenger vehicles. So let me say that again. 60% of our emissions that need to be reduced come from you, the person across the street, the senior on fixed income, right? There is no bad guy left, at least in Massachusetts, to point the finger at, turn the screws on, and you know, break their will so they stop emitting. That's you. We have to break your will, right? I can't even say that publicly. What I'm trying to say is, it is a very difficult situation where we need to transition 3 million homes, and think of that, 3 million construction projects in 30 years. You know, 5 million car sales. And the state of Massachusetts doesn't control the federal auto industry, right? So I'm not saying we can't be ambitious. I'm not saying we should put some level of understanding. Truly, if you really want to solve climate change, you sort of have to sink all the way into it and allow some people to be in the details and advise you well on what you're going to be arguing for certain things in DC. That's fair, right? But there are some things that are probably outside of the control purely of the state of Vermont that will affect your ability to reduce emissions. So I don't mean to be a bummer, but it's a really difficult process. I think this process is fantastic. But that everybody needs to go in wanting the number one thing to do is to achieve the emissions reductions necessary. That is a process in itself, which I think can be done with care, can be done with attention to equity, can be done with attention to the values we place in other land use aspects. But when any one of those comes to such precedent, it has to be number one, then the climate change mitigation effort is no longer number one, and it basically stops. It's so difficult that unless there's some unity around that purpose, it's really difficult for it to go forward. So why don't I stop there? Like I said, I probably have the least relevant process and experience in this kind of work, but I'm really glad to be part of the discussion, and particularly to be followed, I think, by Hannah, who has great experience and is really great to work with. We work together all the time, which is part of this, working together across states to make this happen. So thanks very much.
Thank you, David. And Hannah, it looks like you have control of the screen, and please proceed.
Great. Can you see my slides?
I can.
Okay, great. I can't see them, but I'm gonna go find them somewhere. All right, so, well, thank you. And I think we're all taking a slightly different tack to this presentation, but I'm gonna walk you through more quickly than I really have time for, but Maine's process and actually where we ended up, because I think we are about a year and a half ahead of Vermont. I think we are very similar states and that we're extremely rural. Maine is about double the size of Vermont. But hopefully our process, there's some things that we can certainly tell you, we wish we'd done them differently when we started. So Vermont's got a clean slate, so I wish you all a lot of luck. And I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about Maine Won't Wait, our 4-year plan for climate action. So I'm just going to quickly start and say that Governor Mills took office in 2019. She established a law that created the Maine Climate Council, as well as greenhouse gas reductions in law. And in that same year, we also passed an 80% renewable portfolio standard by 2030, which obviously was an early win and an early kind of significant move to start moving in the direction of decarbonization. So I'm going to mostly talk today about the Maine Climate Council. Again, it came through a law that passed in June of 2019. It set reductions in law, a 45% reduction by 2030 and at least 80% by 2050. In addition, the governor also signed an executive order that the state would achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. And our Maine Climate Council and Maine Climate Law both is about achieving emissions reductions, but also delivering a plan that is about resilience and adaptation. So obviously some states have focused just on the mitigation, the reducing emissions side. We were obviously quite ambitious, and the plan is really about every 4 years delivering an action plan that is about reducing our emissions, but also preparing our economy, our people and communities for the impacts of climate change. So where do Maine's emissions come from? Maine is, like a lot of states, and probably like Vermont, our transportation is our #1 emission source, with 54% of our emissions coming from cars. The majority of those are passenger cars, while freight and other vehicles are obviously also part of the mix. 30% of our emissions come from the residential building sector and the commercial building sector, 9% from industrial emissions, and just 7% from the electricity sector. So Maine already had, under a previous 2 governors ago, Maine had taken action with a climate plan in the early 2000s. We had set a goal then of achieving at least a 10% emissions reduction below 1990 levels by 2020. And every 2 years, our DEP puts out a report of where we are. So right now, as of our last reporting about a year ago, Maine was 17.5% below 1990 levels. So still a ways to go to get to a 45% reduction. So our Maine Climate Council process kicked off again in June 2019. We really didn't get going until the fall of 2019. And then we essentially spent about 9 months of our appointing working groups, and I'll talk a little bit more about those. So the governor appointed a climate council. She appointed 6 working groups, as well as a science and technical subcommittee. And we started working to come up with recommendations to bring forward to the Maine Climate Council to put together a plan. The working groups reported out their ideas in June of 2020. We spent some time doing obviously lots of technical analysis to figure out what the impacts were of the recommendations. And then between June of 2020 and December of 2020, the Climate Council thought about those ideas, looked at the analyses, had to turn a few dials to make sure we achieved at least a pathway to emission reductions to bring a plan forward again this past December 1, 2020. So the 39-member Climate Council, and again, a lot of the states who have spoken have either no Climate Council or more manageable group sizes. We were overly ambitious, trying to figure out how to include lots of stakeholders, The Climate Council includes 15 agency heads and commissioners, 4 legislators, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and then 18 citizens, experts in science, industry, municipalities, a youth member, tribal representative, so a pretty broad and representative group. Then we had, again, our Science and Technical Subcommittee, which is really a group of scientists who sort of started off with the data of what the impacts were that we were seeing in Maine of climate change. And then we've more recently also added an equity subcommittee that really is actually now helping us with the implementation, making sure that the impacts of the varying programs that get rolled out are fairly felt across the state of Maine. So the 6 working groups that really did the bulk of the heavy lifting on coming up with the strategies included transportation, buildings, infrastructure and housing, energy, community resilience planning, public health and emergency management, definitely a mouthful and a huge task, coastal and marine, as well as natural and working lands. So the Climate Council from the beginning, we tried to really infuse it with data, as well as a number of different reports to help advise us on how to put the plan together. So in January, just a couple months after we started, our Science and Technical Subcommittee produced really a huge compendium of data, more data than we could really deal with, but a really helpful assessment of the impacts Maine was seeing from climate. We worked with ERG, a consultant group in Massachusetts, as well as Synapse to help us with a cost-benefit analysis, both the cost of doing nothing, but also the cost and benefits of the strategies being considered. And then obviously the greenhouse gas modeling was key. As we come up with strategies to figure out how to reduce our emissions, what is the impact of each of those strategies? We worked with the University of Maine on an equity assessment as the strategies started to come out, really thinking about how they would, different equity questions of how they would benefit and challenge different communities, how to make sure the benefits were felt broadly, certainly issues that other states are discussing, like just transition, part of that assessment. And lastly, we really tried, I think, and it's important and probably similar to Vermont, to make sure that the messaging as well as the substance of our report was about how the climate transition could help build a better economy for Maine, and especially a state that doesn't have a lot of fossil fuel extraction. We did a significant report as a part of our work on strengthening Maine's clean energy economy. How do we create better jobs in the energy efficiency and energy sector? And then how do we help our industries like fishing, forestry, agriculture to take advantage of opportunities, as well as figure out how to be more resilient to climate change's impacts. So the 4 main goals of our council, these sort of started to come together halfway through our work, obviously to reduce our emissions, to make Maine more resilient, to foster economic opportunity and prosperity, and to advance equity through Maine's climate response. And I think as many members of the council and the administration probably understand, it's clearly important that the messaging around the work of climate, it can be broadly felt, because just a lot of talk about climate data, when it really gets to the average person in Maine or Vermont, obviously they need to understand, what does this mean for them? What does it mean for their community? So I'm going to briefly talk about our strategies. I won't go into detail because I think you're really at the beginning of your process. But in the end, all of the work that came out of our 6 working groups landed in these, everyone likes to call them buckets. So we had 8 buckets of strategies. Some of them are sort of pure, clearly targeted towards one working group. Some of them are broader, bringing together the work of a couple of different working groups. So I'm going to quickly talk about each of them. I'm not going to talk about the details, but my guess, and probably David, as well as New York, would probably say the same thing. The strategies on reducing emissions are not dissimilar across any U.S. state. How we sort of think about resilience, I think, is important, and I think every state might think about that work slightly differently. And then lastly, I would just say, a lot of the work, again, of climate is how do we engage our people in our communities in this work. So transportation, obviously the 54%, again, Maine's emissions. The transition to electric vehicles really has to be the kind of driving strategy of our state's climate transition. How we make our vehicles more fuel efficient, We had a lot of discussion about alternative fuels, but again, when we did our emissions modeling, really the transition to electric vehicles is most important and significant. Reducing vehicle miles traveled. Again, we have a state where a lot of rural people are driving long distances to work and to school. So reducing vehicle miles traveled was a major strategy. And that is everything from expanded broadband, land use planning, as well as public transportation. An issue where I will say we look to Vermont to see how a small rural state really could expand public transportation in places where normal public transportation is really not viable. Modernizing our buildings, obviously significant. The transition to electric heat pumps is probably one of our most primary goals. The governor has a 100,000 heat pump goal by 2025, and Maine has been leading the country in the installation of cleaner heating and cooling systems. Weatherization, obviously important, a slog of a strategy, but an important one in our rural states where people rely on heating oil and have old and inefficient houses. And then obviously the work of leading by example in public buildings, as well as building codes. Significant, but a challenge in a lot of small towns where code enforcement and code enforcement capabilities are challenged. So the reducing our emissions in the energy sector is a lot about renewable energy. And I will just say, we are already on the pathway, but how do we make sure that that transition is possible in an affordable way with the transmission and varying technologies that are going to be workable? That's going to be a long-term process to make sure that we get it right. So the emissions modeling, obviously we spent a lot of time on this chart trying to make sure that our pathway that we chose of strategies actually achieved the results that we needed to hit in terms of both 2030 and 2050 pathways. And I will just say, I'm just going to quickly show you this chart, and I'm happy to share these slides with you. But again, it's a lot about turning the dials of how do you actually get there. And I think our working groups recommended directions, but when you really have to start putting numbers to how many electric vehicles do you need on the road? How much would you need to reduce vehicle miles traveled? How many building heat pump systems would you need to install in order to achieve your reductions? So I would say, Maine, obviously on a very aggressive pathway, not dissimilar from what Massachusetts and New Jersey and California have announced. We need a major transition in both our heating and our transportation sectors to get to where we want to go. So again, a lot of our this work actually offers good job opportunities for the state of Maine, especially in the clean energy sector. We did spend a lot of time in our report talking about what would be needed to make sure that those good paying jobs become a reality for people in Maine. Job training, transmission, new sectors, innovation. So I won't talk a lot about the details. We spent a lot of time on issues of both carbon sequestration. Maine, like Vermont, we are nearly 90% forested. We have already a significant forest that thinking about how we preserve those natural and working lands to ensure their long-term sequestration capability, as well as continue to drive one of the state's largest industries, which is the forest product sector. So obviously a lot on how do we preserve those lands, how do we better monitor and wrap our minds around the data coming out of our forest sector, an area that we have, I would say, a lot of work to do in the next couple of years and are already starting to do that with Vermont. Maine, I know that Vermont really has already felt the brunt of significant weather events. Maine, the issues of sea level rise and the transitions that are going to be required for our coastal infrastructure, as well as our riverfront infrastructure, are absolutely enormous. So how do we start? Really just, we're at the ground level of doing work at the community level, helping towns build resilience plans to better do climate transition work. Again, a lot of that is about transportation infrastructure, wastewater treatment plants, lots of need for new mechanisms to better fund adaptation. And I would say that, again, we are at the early stage. The governor is just putting a bond forward to start an adaptation fund to really start doing the heavy lifting work that I know Vermont has already learned the hard way, that this work is really important. So the last strategy was really about how do we better inform people across our state about both climate change impacts and opportunities to make a difference. This is work that's going to be long time trying to figure out how to make it all happen, but everything from how do we better engage young people who are already really leading the charge on wanting to make a difference on climate, to how do we better engage our business community in climate activity. So I would just say I'm happy to talk more. I went more over the sort of big picture of our work, but I would say the Climate Council put out the 4-year action plan. Our governor announced it. She was really front and center and leading. We are now just starting a legislative session in which we are trying to put various aspects of the plan further into law, into action. But again, with so many different pieces, it's not just about one committee or one set of regulations. It's broad. It's transportation, it's land use planning, it's our efficiency organization, our housing organization. So the work of implementation is really about 4 years of action, and it's certainly not all going to happen in one legislative session. We also, our Climate Council, put forward a number of different areas where we want to monitor the impacts of climate and the impacts of our plan, set specific metrics for things we want to achieve to make sure that we are on the pathway that we set out. And the Climate Council will meet every quarter to continue to look at how's it going, what more do we need to do, and then how do we convince the governor and legislature to continue to do it. And again, like other states, we have to produce a new plan every 4 years. And I think certainly if I'm around to do it again, starting in 3 years, we certainly learn lessons about what to do sooner and later, and in public engagement. Most of this plan was put together via Zoom, which obviously was not our original intention, but it's probably similar to where Vermont will be, and it certainly challenges public engagement. So I will just say our plan is at climatecouncil.maine.gov. We'd love to have you check it out, and happy to stay involved in Vermont's plan. Again, we are, I think, in many ways similar states with similar populations, and we really would love to see you be successful. And we have already learned a lot from looking at the programs that you've already led the charge on. So thank you, and I will hopefully try to figure out how to stop screen sharing here.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Carrie, I think David is going to actually run slides for you. I don't know if you've been able to join us through the Teams app or still just connected by phone. Oh,
yep,
fantastic.
I did. Yeah, I can. If you want, I can run the slide. It doesn't matter either way.
Happy to do whatever's easiest for you.
How about I try to do it? Let's see.
Okay.
It says you didn't get control. Your request for control was not accepted, however.
Huh.
So maybe I will have you do it.
All right. We'll get that. David will bring them up.
Share slides. Yeah. Just give me a sec. I'll pull it up.
Okay.
How's that?
Oh, here it comes.
Okay.
You can see it now.
Yeah, and you can put it into full slide mode if you want. Okay. Do you want to put it into the full slide mode, or is that just me not seeing the full slide mode?
It's just taking a moment. I think it should.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's thinking. Okay, there we go. Great. Well, thanks for inviting me to speak today. It's a pleasure to be with you all and to hear about state processes. As Secretary Moore mentioned, I previously worked for the state of Connecticut and ran our Governor's Council on Climate Change process. So very familiar with these types of processes, lessons learned, and happy to share those as well. So Secretary Moore asked us, the Alliance, to come and speak, both about the resources the Alliance offers to states, as well as providing some insights on how other Alliance states have structured and implemented their council process. So I'll just start off with giving you a bit of an overview of the Alliance resources that we support and to offer the states, and then wrap up with insights on the council processes. So if you're not familiar with the Climate Alliance, we were founded in 2017 by Governors Brown of California, Cuomo of New York, and Inslee of Washington State. These governors came together after the Trump administration announced its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. They invited the other states leading on climate change to join the coalition to help show continued support for the goals of the Paris Agreement and to demonstrate that taking meaningful actions on climate change is critical to both building a strong economy and healthy communities. With representation from both sides of the political aisle, the alliance is truly a bipartisan coalition of 25 governors. While there is no binding requirement for state membership, joining states commit to 3 goals: to collectively reduce emissions by at least 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025, track and report progress, and accelerate implementation of existing and new policies. At the behest of the states, the Alliance Secretariat, where I'm housed, works to help advance the climate and clean energy policy priorities of our governors and their offices. Next slide. So together, the Alliance represents over 50% of the US population and 11.7 trillion of US GDP. Combined, the combined GDP of these states make them equivalent to being the 3rd largest country in the world. So really, when taking collective action, it really transforms markets. Next slide. So clearly, a unique coalition of states. The Secretariat helps these states speak with a unified voice. So as a group of governors with a common goal to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change, it's important that we speak with a unified voice on policies that are critical to ensuring our success. I guess a good example of this is when the Trump administration rolled back the National Clean Car Standards. The Alliance issued the National Clean Car Promise, announcing that states would work together to support a strong national standard that protects their residents from vehicle pollution. We support and facilitate multi-state strategies to help advance markets and transition to the U.S. to a clean energy economy. An example of this multi-state approach is our work with the states to develop a model rule to phase down the production and consumption of HFCs and to implement appliance energy efficiency standards. This type of collaborative approach has led to 11 states adopting appliance efficiency standards and 9 states having promulgated HFC regulations. The Alliance also aims to further inspire climate action at home and abroad by demonstrating policy adoption and implementation that leads to reduced emissions, resilient communities, and economic growth. This type of bold and coordinated subnational climate leadership demonstrates to our sister states, our federal government, and the world that fighting climate change is a winning strategy. And lastly, you can click one more time. And lastly, a primary purpose of the Secretariat is to support the implementation of states' climate policy priorities. Next slide. So we do this through building state capacity, providing technical assistance, convening states to facilitate dialogue, collaboration, peer-to-peer learning and sharing of best practices, and providing tools and resources for advancing climate policy. Much of this work is done through our working groups, where states participate in topic and sector-specific working groups such as clean energy finance, power sector modernization, clean transportation and mobility, building transformation, short-lived climate pollutants, leading by example, emissions inventorying, natural and working lands, and climate resilience. Some of the tools and resources we provide include things such as our resilience and non-wireless solution playbooks, our SLCP Challenge to Action Roadmap, and our solar deployment guidebook. All of these things are available online on our website. We have a SLCP inventory tool, and we also provide project grants, our natural and working lands program, where we have provided states with grants to implement solutions in their state. We also provide technical assistance and with building capacity for staff and stakeholder engagement. Our climate leadership grant program has been a resource for states, both from a technical resource and staffing resource. Yeah, next slide. So I'll now share with you some insights from climate governance and planning. So next slide. So I didn't I just wanted to give you a snapshot of what some of the other states, what their approach is to their governance and their working groups, and give you a sense of what their approach was. You've heard from 3 other states already, which I think was a really good, detailed approach. I wish, to be honest, that when I was in Connecticut that I would have had a presentation like this, because we started in 2015, and I didn't know of any models that existed for how to create the council and its working group. So this is a fabulous resource for you all. So, there really is no wrong or right way to structure these entities. How you select the members to the working groups or structure how the work gets done. Some states have taken a variety of different approaches, whether it be membership appointment from the governor through an executive order or legislation, membership by application, having people submit what subcommittee they might want to be on and why they're qualified, which groups identified by the governor, might be, again, executive order, or establishing the working groups after an initial meeting where the council members decide what the needs are based on the direction from your leadership. State agencies, are they responsible for drafting the reports, or is it the working groups or other consultant, for instance? Are your decisions going to be consensus based, or you have voting procedures set up and majority rules? And just to talk about a few best practices, clarity on council objectives and deliverables. So, are you making a set of recommendations? Are you doing an analysis? Are you, ultimately putting out a report? Just being clear what those objectives and deliverables are. Transparency on decision-making process from the start. I will say in Connecticut, we didn't have a process that we presented at the very beginning, and what we came to find out was people want that, and which makes sense. So we elected to do a consensus-based approach, and so the recommendations that we came up with were all based on consensus. But other states have taken a different approach where they had voting procedures and then they had dissenting opinions. Clear timelines and milestone requirements. So as your working groups get to work, make sure that there is a sense of what needs to get done by when, and presenting that from the beginning. And then agreement on who's doing what. Is there working groups making recommendations up to the council? Who will write those report contents? Who are the working group chairs? Are the agency staffers? Are the consultants? A few things to think about. And then I'll talk, I think, a few things for you all to think about as you start your analysis or your discussion of policies. Will the recommendations be based on policy discussions amongst the governing entity and working groups, and incorporate stakeholder feedback, or will you be identifying criteria in which to evaluate the recommendations? I think we saw in other folks' slides that things such as GHG emissions, cost benefit, job creation, co-benefits, feasibility were all criteria to evaluate policies that came forward. And will you be doing the modeling before the recommendations, after, or none at all? So in Connecticut, again, the council members were appointed by the governor. Our working groups consisted of council members and agency staff, and the recommendations were a direct result of the decarbonization's pathway analysis and macroeconomic modeling. So we actually did not complete our recommendations until after we completed both of those analyses before solidifying the recommendation. So it was a really laborious and time-consuming process, and we started in 2015, and the final report came out in December of 2018. And we also took a consensus-based approach, as I mentioned earlier, when developing the recommendations, which, is never easy to find consensus. So that often took longer than originally anticipated. Next slide. So taking a closer look, so this is just again, a snapshot of the different types of working groups different states have adopted. Up there at the top, those are the mitigation, adaptation and resiliency, equity, and environmental justice. Those are the 3 that are most common and tend to be kind of the overarching working groups. And then you kind of move into the sector-specific working groups like buildings, electricity, transportation, science, technology. That seems to be, the second tier and second common. And then going down another level, you see these, innovation, infrastructure, technology, financing. So I think that, there's a variety of different ways to create your subgroups or sub-working groups, and depending on what your objectives are, to define what those need to be. Next slide. And then let's talk a little bit about stakeholder engagement. So I'm not going to walk through each of these. I think every state has done stakeholder engagement before, and you're probably very familiar with these strategies listed here. But I can provide you with some thoughts on best practices that states have taken to improve their stakeholder engagement processes. So start the engagement process early. Be transparent about the objectives, process, and deliverables. Offer as many options to participate as you can. Obviously, COVID presents us with a little bit of a challenge for in-person meetings. So I'm sure that much of this will probably be virtual, but we have heard from a lot of states that participation rates have actually increased due to everything being virtual. So, take advantage of that and utilize that to reach more people. Aim to reduce barriers to public participation, host evening meetings on the weekends. If you do eventually get to in-person meetings, provide free childcare, food if it's at mealtime, make the location accessible, move meetings around, cite the meetings where there's access to public transportation, and then translation of materials to be inclusive of other language speakers. Educate while engaging. So if you have topical webinars or workshops, to engage and educate and build capacity amongst your council members as well as the public. Facilitate roundtable activities and discussions, that will allow for brainstorming of ideas, coming to consensus, and allowing for the best ideas to emerge. I will say in Connecticut, we did do a Exploring Climate Change Solutions series where we actually offered, it started out as monthly, or maybe it was bi-monthly, webinars where we invited experts and folks from, that had real firsthand experience implementing climate solutions. And this was really a great way to build the capacity of our council members and, again, the public. So I think that was a useful tool. And then recruit participation from unlikely participants to diversify perspectives. So that might be direct invites or speaking opportunities, or other creative ways to get folks who would not necessarily participate in this type of process involved. My last slide, move on to the next slide. Thanks. So in this concluding slide, I just wanted to talk about a few best practices to think about when developing your recommendations. If you can make them specific and provide clear and concise direction with measurable outcomes. The slide that Hannah had about how many vehicles, how much VMT need to be reduced, it's really hard to come up with those, and they're not going to, they might change over time, but I think it is very helpful to help people grasp the reality of what needs to be accomplished. So I do encourage you to try to figure out what those numbers are. Include implementation timing for each recommendation. Is this recommendation going to happen in the next year or two, or 5 years, or is this a long-term 10 to 15-year strategy? Identify the responsible party for implementation of that recommendation. Is it a state agency? Is it businesses? Is it the legislature? Commitment to a regular progress report. So I think the other states on the line, already have that in place. So, things change. Commitment to reevaluate recommendations and adjust as new information and science emerges. So, as things evolve, this is a quickly evolving space with new technologies rapidly advancing. So that commitment to regular reporting and regular updating of your strategies or your tactics is, I think, a good thing to implement. Assessment of economic costs and benefits. So, you might want to think about doing REMI modeling or in-plan. Several states in the Alliance have taken these approaches to understand what that economic level impacts are, which helps to demonstrate that there's opportunities for economic growth that go hand in hand with mitigating emissions. And then lastly, integrate climate change planning into existing planning and policy requirements. So I think every state has some type of energy plan or conservation development plan or integrated resource plan, statewide transportation plan. I feel like we're, as a former state employee, I felt like I was swamped with writing plans all the time. So think about how you can integrate some of the planning that you put forward into these existing plans. So it's really integrated, and you don't necessarily have to have a climate plan that sits separate and different from these other planning documents. So with that, I will wrap up and just say thank you, and I look forward to discussion.
Okay. Sorry, this is David trying to unmute myself. Secretary Moore asked if I could help facilitate this this Q&A. We have these 4 folks here who have walked this path, right, with great presentations, and now's our opportunity to ask them some questions. There have been some in the chat already from council members. I want to encourage you to think about what's going to happen next after the break, which is you're going to talk about your own process roadmap and start to make some decisions around that. And so I would encourage you to think about, taking advantage of having these 4 people right now to ask them some questions that might be on your mind, particularly as it relates to your process roadmap going forward. I see a bunch of stuff in the chat, but before I do that, I just want to see if anybody else has some questions real quick, and then I'll jump to what's in the chat already. So this is an opportunity for the Vermont Climate Council folks to ask some questions. Members of the public, we will have some opportunity at the end of today's meeting for you all to ask some live questions as well. So council members, anything on your minds right now for these 4 folks who have walked down this path? Great, I'm seeing some raised hands. Give me 1 second. My team's a little slow, I have to apologize. Richard Cohort, go ahead, please.
I guess I would ask all of the presenters if they could comment on the structures used in their processes to help guide the work of fairly large councils. It seems to me, we need, and you must have needed, some kind of steering committee or governance committee of some kind to, on behalf of the council, to arrange the workflow and help everybody get organized to get the work done. So I'm really interested to know, how have you selected those steering or executive committees, and what kind of responsibilities have they been given, to assist organizing the work?
Why don't we jump right into that question before I go to Jared? And I'll invite Hannah Pingree and others who want to jump in and describe how they managed to keep all the balls in the air in the process moving forward. So Hannah, do you want to start with you?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. And I would say we had a steering committee structure. So I co-chaired the council with the head of our Maine Department of Environmental Protection. And then each of our working groups was co-chaired. One of each of those co-chairs worked in state government. They weren't all commissioners. There were a couple of commissioners or deputy commissioners. So they had staff to help lead. Every working group had at least a couple technical staff from agencies, but really a lead staffer and some facilitation support, because it was a lot to manage it all. My office, which was a policy office for the governor, kind of oversaw the whole thing. So my staff tried to stay hinged to what was happening across all the working groups. But we had a monthly steering committee meeting where we had all of the co-chairs of the working group sort of talk about process, talk about how we engage with consultants, how it was going. It was sort of we were all learning as we were building the plane, flying the ship, everything else. But I would say we tried to have the committees and the committee chairs talk to each other about what was the timeline, what we were trying to achieve by what dates, sort of how much detail were we going to get into in terms of the actual recommendations, and then again, engagement with consultants. I will just say one of the things I saw in the chat was, what do we wish we'd done? And I would say, engage with your consultants in starting some of that analysis work as quickly as humanly possible, because I think some of that analysis takes time and we got it late in the process. And so it wasn't as able to inform the working groups and sort of fully understanding the ramifications of what they were proposing. So as soon as you can get your consultants on board, especially modeling consultants around how reduction of emissions strategies, really make sure your working groups understand that. So again, I would recommend a steering committee process. There's a lot of different leaders likely involved in any kind of process like this, and having them all talk regularly to each other about what the game plan is, what they're trying to achieve, and by when. You definitely have to do that in some organized way, because there's so many moving parts and issues happening.
Thanks, Hannah. I wonder, Maureen or others, if you want to add quickly on top of that, and then we'll jump into another question. Other thoughts?
I'll add really quickly. One thing I think that you guys are doing correctly from the outset is having Jane in place and having your facilitation consultant in place. When we had started this process, the state of New York was looking to hire, some new state staff, and then we got hit with serious budget issues related to the COVID response, and that got put on hold. So we lost a lot of time in terms of having that structure in place to really manage the process. We're getting there now, but it would have been way, way more efficient if that was in place at the outset. So that's one thing I will say.
Right.
And in Connecticut, we took a similar approach to Hannah. So it was my team that actually managed the behind the scenes. The co-chairs were council members, but really all the work was done by the state agency. So I had a team of 5 people that were helping me. It was a all hands on deck process.
Okay, great. Let's jump to Jared's question. Jared, go ahead, please.
Thanks, David, and thank you everyone for the presentations. I have a question that could be seen as fairly technical, and I don't want to get into the weeds of it, but I think it's really important just to float up and get some initial responses, and maybe we can have some additional follow-up after the meeting. Maureen, I was very interested to hear that New York, and before I ask the question, I should just say, I think one of the most important things that we can do as a council is focus on having transparency and confidence about our emissions and ensuring that we're actually making emissions reductions. You talked about kind of the way that your emissions inventory is being changed, working to avoid leakage. I think that there's 2 things that I'm really interested to look more into, and that is, one, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, EPA, they all recommend a life cycle timeframe of global warming potential 100 years. I was very interested to hear that to account for methane and other shorter-lived greenhouse gases, you're moving to a GWP 20 timeframe. I think there's also this question, in order to avoid leakage, about whether or not we should just follow the standard practice of doing in-boundary or territorial inventories, or look at consumption-based inventories that might be able to present a fuller picture of our responsibility for emissions. So my specific question is, Maureen, can you say anything more about what went into that decision about GWP 20, and also if you're considering a consumption-based inventory to supplement your territorial inventory? And then for the other states, are those issues that you're looking at as well? Thank you.
So yeah, the 20-year global warming potential was part of the negotiations of the act itself. And I don't really have a lot of insight into what went on there, but you follow the trail, and it's to place emphasis mostly on methane and the leakage of methane that occurs along the natural gas T&D system from landfills and other sources, to really put emphasis on the impact from methane. It is a tension, because our progress is measured against what happens within the statewide inventory in that accounting process. And I think how it's up to the council and the scoping plan really to determine, but I think the way that you sort of thread the needle is you can use carbon intensity life cycle type analysis to direct policy, but in the end, you need to be seeing reductions in your state boundary accounting methodology. So there's a way to sort of to use both methods to achieve your outcome. So you have to sort of look carefully at how, if that's happening, right? Like if you lean too much on one side, you might be overlooking reductions that need to occur within your own state, particularly when you're looking at things like sequestration, right? That needs to happen within your own state in order to count towards your inventory.
Right, and the other folks want to mention that an approach to Jared's question real quick?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. I think just adding to what Maureen said, I think we see it very similarly. I think in the end, none of these states can fix climate all by itself. And so I think there's more value in us all adopting the same approach. In Massachusetts, we've adopted what the EPA recommends, and I hope the EPA flourishes in its climate efforts. But in that respect, jurisdictional accounting aligns with jurisdictional power. So, there's this, and life cycle accounting is extraordinarily difficult. It's extraordinarily difficult to do accurately. I think the place we've seen it done best is by one of our largest states, California, in one of the most narrow aspects, and that's fuel, biofuels. So they've picked a very, very narrow, heavily regulated industry to try and do life cycle accounting, and they have tens of people working on it, if not hundreds. So, and then there's this interesting thing, we talk about responsible things we're responsible for. There's emissions and there's emissions. If we were to adopt life cycle emissions, you're essentially letting somebody else off the hook, right? So another state which has the ability to jurisdictionally turn down a smokestack says, those aren't our emissions. They're Vermont's emissions. They're 1/1000th Maine's emissions and Massachusetts emissions. And yet we don't have the actual ability to change a manufacturing process or to mandate that a tractor run on biodiesel in Iowa. So I think there's more to be lost than to gain from life cycle emissions. They're emotionally powerful to talk about sort of what your burden is as a person or a consumer, but when you get to the reality of being able to track it, and the other thing I think we all need to, being accurate is important. So what you can track accurately, this is fundamentally an emissions over time problem. And so guessing and estimating and winging it, I guess I'm just skeptical that those things will lead to the kind of dramatic real world behavior changes, where money's going to have to change hands.
Thank you. Very helpful.
So we're at the top of the hour, and so we had scheduled a break at this point. There's a lot of interesting questions in the chat, which I don't think we're going to get answers to right now. But I will want to suggest that we keep these questions that are in the chat and we send an email out to our 4 panelists and see what we get back if folks are willing to write a few answers to that. I think that might be a nice way to get input on these interesting questions that are in the chat.
I'd be happy to.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. So with that, I think I'll thank the 4 panelists for investing time in today's meeting and sharing their thoughts. Thank all 4 of you. It's fantastic. Let's, as a Climate Council, let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break and turn off our cameras and go get some coffee or whatever we need to do. And we'll be back right around 10:15 and probably get started around 10:16 or so. So we'll see you back here at 10:15. Thanks everybody again. And we were
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. And we will see everybody back here in just under 15 minutes. Okay?
Thank
Thanks,
you. And I'll
folks.
stop recording
Thanks.
during the
Good
break.
luck, Vermont.
Thanks.